Please join me in giving Keith Hall a warm welcome. So his plan is to talk to her about 30 minutes, so we have, or a little bit more, and then we have some time for questions. Thank you. Welcome.
Good afternoon. I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about CBO and the role CBO plays, mix in a little bit about the role of research for us, and then talk about one of our favorite subjects at CBO, the long-term budget outlook. Now, I'll try not to depress you too much, but the long-term budget outlook is just a depressing topic. Well, first of all, CBO was created by the Congressional Budget and Empowerment Control Act of 1974. We were set up to be an objective and impartial agency that is strictly nonpartisan, and we provide analysis of budgetary and economic issues. The director, towards that goal, the director is appointed jointly by the Speaker of the House and the President pro tem of the Senate. CBO has about 235 employees, hired solely on the basis of professional competence and without regard to political affiliation. Most have advanced degrees. In fact, 80% of our folks have an advanced degree, either a PhD or a master's degree. So we have a lot of expertise. And one of the things that you can't do when you're at CBO is you can't offer opinions on policy issues because we are worried about the appearance of impartiality, and we're worried about, obviously, being able to work impartially and objectively in our work. In that goal, towards that goal, we do a number of things to try to ensure that we're nonpartisan and objective. We use a lot of outside experts. For example, when we are looking at legislation, we always ask the committee, Congressional committee, what research do you want us to look at? What data do you want us to look at? Then we start what I like to think of as our due diligence. We talk to outside experts, we talk to people, we use our own expertise, and we come to our own conclusions and use our own data to provide estimates. When we write something, it has extensive internal review. So it's never just a single person or a small group. It has extensively reviewed. For our analytical work, we actually send things out to external professionals to review like it would be a journal. And we try very hard to get a variety of opinions on things. We send it to a variety of folks. We try to clearly present review of literature, things like that. Sometimes we even will publish our literature review on certain topics. We try to document our models as well as we can. We do a fair amount of presentation on our models. We even write working papers describing our analysis. I'll give you, for example, a couple years ago, we did an analysis of what would happen if the ACA was fully repealed. And we did, for the first time, a dynamic analysis of that. Not only just what would happen with the repeal, but what would the effect be on GDP growth and how that sort of feed back into the effect. And so that involved a fairly complicated labor market model. Well, as a working paper, we published a labor market model and explained how we arrived at our results. It's also, and we have a panel of economic advisors that meets twice a year, and it's a diverse panel. If you get on our website, you can see who's involved in it. They're willing to not only devote their time to talk to us about things during panel meetings, but we now have their phone numbers and their emails, and we use them to help us not only sometimes comment on things, but help us connect with researchers around. And we have a panel of health advisors, a similar panel that meets once a year to talk about healthcare issues and our modeling of healthcare. And our role is we're really part of the budget process. You're created to be part of the budget process of Congress. In fact, the budget process starts with a CBO publication. In late January, we produce our economic and budget forecast, 10-year budget forecast. And that becomes a baseline on the budget over the next 10 years that we then use to analyze new legislation. How will new legislation affect this 10-year budget forecast? How will it impact things? We update that in the spring. We update that often in the summer. We update the economic forecast beneath it. We also produce long-term budget projections, which I'll be talking about in a minute. So we take our 10-year budget forecast and economic forecast and extend that out 30 years. We want to make sure that there's an understanding of things. And we produce cost estimates. As I say, we have that 10-year forecast, the 10-year budget and economic forecast as the baseline. Well, when we get new legislation, we'll estimate the budgetary effects off that baseline. If you look at us lately, you think all we do is healthcare. But last year, we produced 676 different cost estimates on things. And some of them are really easy, admittedly. Changing the name of a federal building is probably not that hard. But healthcare is really hard. And we have a lot of topics to cover, so we do a lot of things. We also provide an analysis of the president's budget. In fact, I think that's the most recent big report that we've produced. So not only do you get the president's budget and the president's, the executive branch analysis of the likely impact of that budget over the next 10 years, we do an independent analysis of that. We also do scorekeeping for enacted legislation to help Congress keep track of things. And then we provide analytical reports, 60 or 70 analytical reports a year. It can be a lot of things. One thing comes to mind, for example, is because it was heavily involved in a lot of analysis of research, we've produced an analysis of the likely impact of a minimum wage when the proposal was something like 10% minimum wage. That was a really challenging thing for us because there's so much literature on that. It involved a lot of reading of the literature and, of course, culling through the literature because there's so much literature on there that the quality is not the same. So it wasn't just an accounting of literature, but it was going through and seeing what we thought was the best literature and was most informative in doing the work like that. And that's always a challenge. Well, the long-term budget outlook, this is where I turn really pessimistic for you. When we're doing our projection, what we're doing, even if it's a 10-year or a longer projection, we're telling Congress that under current law, this is where we see the budget heading over the next 10 years. It's based on an economic forecast. And one of the things that's been really clear for a long time is that if current laws governing taxes and spending don't change, the condition of the federal budget will worsen over the next 3 decades, worsen over the next 10 years, in fact, pretty significantly. In particular, growth in federal spending will continue to outpace growth in federal revenues. Both are going to increase over the next 10 years and next 30 years, but spending is going to outpace it to even larger federal deficits. Right now, the deficit is roughly 3% of GDP. In 10 years, it'll be about 5% of GDP. In 30 years, it'll be about 10% of GDP. Now, to put that in perspective, discretionary spending is about 5% of GDP, all of discretionary spending. Right? So we're talking about a deficit that's now getting quite large. And you'll see a nice graphical view here of what the story is. You see revenues actually are increasing over time. They start at a level that's higher than the 50-year average. Revenues are already at a high level historically right now. And spending, which is high relative to historical levels, and increasing, but increasing faster than revenues are. Then here's the most depressing graph I think I've got for you. Here's the accumulated debt. Right now, the debt is about 75% of GDP. Now, one of the things you'll notice is in 2007, it was at a high level, about 35% of GDP, and it doubled in about 5 years, the accumulated debt. Right? One of the things that we're benefiting from right now is low interest rates. Over the next 10 years, the biggest impact is going to be from rising interest rates to more normal levels, and we're going to see a big increase in the debt from about 75% of GDP to about 90, almost 90% of GDP. Now, if you look at the all-time record after World War II, it was a little over 100% of GDP. All right? Under current law, we're going to blow that away. We're going to get up to something like 150% of GDP. Now, a natural question is, how sure are we of this? What's the level of uncertainty in this? So one of the things that we do is we look at some of the key variables like interest rates and productivity and some of those things and see how much they've varied historically over the past 50 years and then vary those going forward. And when we do that, we get a debt in 30 years that ranges between 85% of GDP and 244% of GDP. So as we always do, that number, that point estimate we offer, the 150%, we think it's just as likely to be higher than that as it is lower than that. We always try to offer the median value there. In particular, federal spending is projected to rise noticeably from Social Security, major health care programs, and interest on the government's debt. The first two things, Social Security, major health care programs, those rises are dominated by an aging population, as you guys would know. And this is a problem that we've seen coming for decades. It's going to happen. It's coming. One of the things that's going to be important about this, here are the components of federal spending, is if you look at the relative categories of spending. Major healthcare programs, spending on that as a percent of GDP is really growing significantly over the next 30 years. Social Security is growing significantly. And net interest is growing pretty significantly. In fact, you see just paying off the interest on the debt is heading up to like 6 or 7%. I'd like to point out, again, right now, total discretionary spending, defense and non-defense, is about 5% of GDP. So you're looking at net interest being a much bigger component than discretionary spending even, eventually. Big part of that, of course, is net interest, is the interest rates going back to normal levels, but also it's this continued accumulation of debt from the aging population. One category is not increasing, other non-interest spending. Everything outside of this is actually decreasing as a share of GDP. In fact, after the end of 30 years, other non-interest spending, discretionary spending, and other non-discretionary spending will be at its lowest level in 70 years. So when you hear talk about things like investment in infrastructure, defense spending, anything like child nutrition, veterans benefits, all those are out of this discretionary other non-interest spending. And under current law, that's actually declining over time. So we have sort of a different kind of crowding out there, if you think about it. Federal revenues will also increase under current law. They won't increase as much as spending. The only category actually that's going to increase over the next 30 years is individual income tax. Everything else is going to decline under current law as a share of GDP. The primary increase in individual income tax is real bracket creep. The fact that real incomes tend to grow faster than GDP. And again, you have to now sort of imagine this is under current law. So current law means that Congress doesn't give in and change tax brackets, doesn't increase discretionary spending, doesn't increase infrastructure spending. You don't have any of that happening, which could happen, of course. Now, there's one aspect of this which is not current law, and that's the trust funds. Congress asked us when we do this work to not assume that the trust funds just run out of money, but that the government continues to pay all the benefits, the full benefits going forward. So one of the things you're going to see, this is a really good graph on that, projections of Social Security revenues and outlays. You see the dark line on outlays goes up to a certain point and then suddenly goes down. Those are the trust funds running out. And so under our forecast, that 150% of GDP debt hitting that, that's this dashed line, outlays with scheduled benefits. And if for some reason Congress didn't make any changes, then we'd slip to where outlays with payable benefits, we'd only be able to pay about 70% of what's owed in payable benefits if Congress did nothing. Okay. Our numbers compared to the trustees' numbers, they're a little bit different. We have lower revenue than they do going forward. We're about 6% lower. We have higher costs than they do. We have about 7% higher costs. Now, one of the things that we do is because we update our 10-year forecast maybe 3 times a year, we update a long-run forecast once a year. So we do make changes in it based on what we see happening in the near term as well as the long term. We see that under current law, the combined trust funds would be exhausted in 2030. I think the trustees have it in 2034. That represents a little bit of minor differences. We have the DI trust fund being exhausted in 2023, the OASI one in 2031. So again, we're a little bit different. And here we see the exhaustion of the combined trust funds in our forecast. And here you see our 75-year actuarial balance. So we see the balance is now about negative 1.5% of GDP. We've just adjusted that. It used to be about 1.6%. I'll tell you why we've changed that. Well, I'll give you an advance. I'll tell you why we've changed that. We've been doing a lot of thinking about labor force participation. That's been a challenging thing because we've had a real change in labor force participation. And we've done a fair amount of work breaking it out by age and by demographic to understand that better. Clearly part of what's happened with the Great Recession is we've had this sort of permanent loss of labor force going forward. And then, of course, as I'm sure you all probably know, cohort analysis of our labor force participation is really important. The baby boomers are hanging in there better than anybody has in the past in terms of labor force participation. Everybody else is lagging behind the baby boomers. So you have the younger cohorts, they're all at a lower labor force participation than the baby boomers were at their age. And that's clearly one of the challenges going forward. The second thing is income inequality. All right, there's been a trend of rising income inequality up to now, and we are forecasting that trend to sort of continue as a trend. So that has an impact, of course, in the tax max for Social Security. One of our differences between the trustees is they assume reasonably, they're just different assumptions. They assume that the income inequality is now flat and will go on flat from now on at its current level. So we lose some revenues with our rising income inequality. So as I said, our 2 change projections is our labor force participation. We've actually just raised that a little bit. And our projection of the share earnings that are taxable for Social Security has changed. And those things have both added a little bit to the 75-year balance. And that's worked against a few things. Lower projected productivity. Productivity is a really hard thing to project, by the way. And lower projected interest rates. Primarily there, as we're seeing the Federal Reserve changing their pattern of interest rate changes. Again, what's going to be a long-term interest rate is hard to project. Changes in demographics, we've made some changes in that lately. That hasn't been terribly significant going forward. So we project larger deficits in Social Security's finances than does the trustees. They see the 75-year actuarial balance to be negative 1% of GDP, which is about a half a percentage point smaller than ours. So again, it's not a huge difference, but it's a difference. Again, a lot of that actually is GDP growth, projected GDP growth going forward. And the projected shortfall between income and cost. Right, that's a little bit different. They see it as about 1.5%, we see it at 1.5%, about 4 percentage points smaller than, they see it as 1.5, we see it at about 1.9%, a little bit smaller. Different projections of factors that influence things. Taxable earnings, we see lower interest rates, and we have slower economic growth. In fact, we see potential economic growth settling in at about 1.8, 1.9% of GDP. And that one comes from, if you want to just see a simple recipe, look at productivity, look at labor force growth. We've got a labor force growth challenge with aging baby boomers. We've just adjusted our forecast of immigration, for example. We don't see immigration increasing very much. And then we see the productivity returning to somewhat like a normal level, but not at the very high levels that existed at one point, back in, say, in the 70s or something like that. Our use of research and data. We do look at a broad range of evidence. We look at studies, we look at historical data for federal programs. Every year, in fact, we do an analysis of federal programs to see if they're behaving the way we forecast and adjust our forecast every year. We do read a lot of research. One of the things that we started to do lately, which I really like, is we started to look at some of the areas where we don't know much about what's going to happen in things, where we think there's a gap in research. So we started to put up occasional blogs where we talk about a topic that we have trouble with because there just isn't much research on it. And the hope would be folks would look at our blog and see some areas that we think are gaps. And if you want to be helpful, look at our blog. This is something that we started to talk a bit about with our economic advisory panel, encouraging graduate students that if they have some graduate students that want some topics, they talk with us. We have some areas where some research would be really helpful. We also conduct our own original research. These are our analytical papers. Like I say, we produce 60, 70 of those a year. We try to make them on topics that Congress is interested in. And one of our challenges really is, in our research papers, we never make recommendations. In fact, we just don't make recommendations, period. But we will offer up, here are a number of options, here are a number of policy proposals related to a topic, and we'll do an analysis of each of those proposals. This is sort of the classic Econ 101, positive versus normative analysis, right? We do positive analysis. If you do this, this is a likely result. If you do something else, this is a likely result. We work very hard on that. Sometimes use specialized data. Our long-term models are estimated using Social Security administrative data, matched with survey data. Do a lot of work like that. And this is supposed to encourage you to do research here, this slide. So here are some topics, for example. We've estimated some things like marital transitions for individuals in our long-term model, characteristics of women who have babies in any given years, characteristics of workers claiming benefits at various ages. Actually, this is the slide I was thinking of. Earnings inequality and labor force participation still are really important to us. We're really trying to forecast that. That's important in our forecast of this. Other research areas, employer-sponsored health insurance. What's likely to happen with that, especially with health care changes. And state decisions regarding Medicaid program. That's been a particular challenge for us because now we're trying to not just forecast the economy and forecast individuals' behavior, we're trying to now forecast states' behavior about their willingness to have Medicaid expansion. It gets to be a challenge. All right, well, I didn't give you the really hard sell on the long-term budget outlook. I could have spent a lot more time really depressing you, but I made it easy for you. Do you all have any questions you want to ask?
Yes.
Do we need to have people come up and?
Yes, yes, they need a lot of instruction.
Okay.
So,
So do I.
so if you have questions, please come up to the microphones and to say who you are.
Kerry Pector, Retirement Income Journal. There's a whole school of economists who feel that when you present that tower of red ink, that you're only presenting half of the country's balance sheet, and that there's an equal and opposite level of assets on the other side of the balance sheet in the private sector. So that if you looked at that debt as, say, the country's, so that you could look at that debt as a very different thing, almost like maybe the country's market capitalization, which, I mean, you could say that Apple's stock price is depressing because it forces them now to, they'll never be able to sell enough products over enough time to justify paying back everybody for it. But anyway, that's probably not a good comparison. But a number of people have pointed out that the situation is not really dire because on the other side of the balance sheet, it just looks bad because you're just looking at half of it.
Well, I say one of the things that's important probably about what we're doing is if you look at that debt graph as a share of GDP, every year we update this, it gets worse because there are two things. It's at a really high level and it's going up at a very fast rate. But you're right, we're not looking at assets, we're looking at the government's ability to pay, right? And we put it as a share of GDP to give you some idea of the size of the economy that matches with it. Actually, a lot of people give us a hard time because we don't have the continued obligations of the government beyond 30 years. That even though we give you a snapshot there are obligations that go beyond that aren't in there as well. But there are other things we could do. Yes.
Deborah Bisco, I was Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. I retired Monday.
Congratulations.
So I'm still interested in things, so I came. The topic generally I wanted to ask you about was immigration, both legal and illegal. I realize you're probably involved in trying to assess costs for bills, such as reduction of legal immigration that has now been in the press. But a lot of immigration, legal and illegal, is affected also just by policy, which I assume gets caught up only in the projections for the 10-year or the 30-year. What do you see as the net economic effects for the country of both legal and illegal immigration in general?
Well, I can give you some idea of what we've done with respect to growing immigration. The last few years, under the previous administration, they had proposals on immigration, on expanding immigration. So we did some analysis of the likely impact of that and the impact, the dynamic impact as well on GDP growth. So you look at that, you can get some idea of what we see with that, of increasing immigration from current levels. We haven't done anything about just sort of idly changing it. We have done analysis of President Obama's proposals on increasing immigration. We could do the reverse if needed.
My name is David Hartz. I do tax returns for individuals. My question relates to the Affordable Care Act replacement. In the most recent analysis, you have indicated that I believe 22 million people will lose their health care. How many, as a result of repeal and replace, how many of these people will voluntarily no longer buy health insurance because the individual mandate will be eliminated and the employer mandate for small employers will be eliminated also?
Sure. Well, let me mention two things. Is one, our analysis of the 22 million is against the baseline. So we're not saying 22 million it will drop 22 million from its current level. It will drop 22 million from its projection increase under the ACA. Right, just to be clear. So we would say there's a drop in coverage. These aren't necessarily people losing coverage. So that's one of the things that getting the language right sometimes is important. We don't know exactly on that, and the reason for that is when you have the ACA, the ACA, the repeal and replace, a number of things are changing at the same time as you're reducing the mandate, right? So the right exercise would have been, if we've been so rushed with stuff, we haven't had time to do a lot of playing with this. The right exercise would have been, what would the effect of the ACA be with and without the mandate? And that one I just don't know. But in the first couple of years of our estimate, we have coverage dropping by about 15 million. That early drop is primarily from the mandate. But that doesn't mean that those people wouldn't drop out later if the mandate was still in place, if you know what I mean. We have done an exercise, for example, in our budget options where we looked at the effect of, under current law, what if you just eliminated the mandate? And we find about 15 million people would drop coverage. But that's a little bit different exercise because that's under the context of the ACA, not in the context of a new healthcare system.
Thank you.
Keith, can I ask you a question on the Social Security projections? Because,
Sure.
as you know, the actuaries don't like it that in the budget, they're continuing payment of benefits, even though under current law, you said you can't pay benefits if you don't have money. Does having that benefit payment line decline help that picture a lot?
Well, first of all, the reason we assume that benefits are paid is Congress told us to assume that benefits are paid. So we aren't even making that decision.
So you
Okay.
have no choice.
So we have no, but we also do something else. We also do an alternate scenario where we have the benefits not being paid.
Okay.
And so we do. So if you look at our long-term budget outlook, you see both scenarios, you get an idea. If you're Congress, though, keep in mind you move from a really big deficit problem to not as big a deficit problem, but now you have a problem of people don't get their benefits.
Yep.
So it's a problem either way. But we do it both ways to give an idea.
Good. And the interest rates that you have in the Social Security projections are the same ones you use for the budget?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
So
My-
you're,
Sorry.
sorry, go.
Okay. My name is Gail Becker. I'm retired federal employee from Department of Health and Human Services. I'd like to suggest that healthcare costs could be enormously reduced if people became healthier. And to me, I believe that the primary way to do that is to reduce the incidence of tobacco, or hold the tobacco companies responsible for providing health care to tobacco users and their families. Okay, so that's one thing. And I don't think that has been explored by anybody in leadership positions about making the population healthier to reduce health care costs. So let's increase health, reduce health care. What is your opinion about that?
Well, we haven't done anything on the tobacco. The issue about some changes that might reduce healthcare cost that involve federal spending, that's a tough trade-off for us sometimes, right? Because if you have the government spending money, then you have this, well, does it pay for itself, right? Do people become healthier, that it somehow pays with higher tax revenue, that sort of thing. That's sometimes a big issue with us, is trying to figure out this sort of matching trade-off and something like that. It's difficult to now analyze, but if we had a serious proposal, if we had a legislation proposal to do something like you're suggesting, we would do an analysis of it. We'd do our best. I can't predict what the answer would be.
Keith, can I ask you one more question before
Sure.
the next questioner? So you have those major health programs just going up and up.
Right.
So in that, after 30 years, what % of GDP is going just to health care? It's 17% now. I mean, it's just.
Yeah. You know, I don't know offhand. That actually might be in one of my graphs here. Let me cheat and look at my graphs to give you some idea.
We spend so much more than other countries. It's just.
Right. Yeah, in 30 years, we have it getting up to, looks like 8 or 9% of GDP. And right now, it's about 6%. So we have it
These are
going.
government programs.
Yeah, these are just
Yeah.
government programs, that's
Okay,
right.
so 3 percentage points more. Okay.
Right, right. Yes.
Do you ever, or has CBO ever done a projection of hypothetical tax increases? We haven't had a tax increase since Clinton in whenever it was, 1993 or 4, and the fiscal cliff where the taxes were allowed to go up. Do you ever look at the effect of a possible tax increase, or do you have to wait for a proposal from Congress?
I got kind of two versions of two parts to this answer. First of all, when we do cost estimates, we're required to go to the Joint Committee on Taxation to get the tax estimates. So it's a common misunderstanding. You may understand it, but it's a common misunderstanding for folks because we get their estimate and put it into one of our reports and send it out like it's ours, even though we do say it's from JCT.
Right.
So we wouldn't be doing that work. I don't know lately. I don't know that we've done anything like that lately. We would look at proposals, and we might do research on something like that. On tax increases, it's less likely because the Joint Committee on Taxation would be more likely to be interested in that topic and maybe do a paper looking at different tax regimes.
I just wondered because we have lots of detail on spending increases that are coming under current law.
Right.
And it would be useful to know what sort of tax you would need to keep things level or to balance the budget or whatever.
Right, right. Yeah, no, and that made the tax effect, the effects of tax changes and all that is probably going to be of interest coming forward when we have some specific proposals.
Thank you.
Yes.
Jeremy Smith with the Aspen Institute. I'm curious if you wouldn't share a little bit more of your thinking. It's a very big macro issue, but your expectation that interest rates are going to sort of return to historical norms. What drives that? I mean, you know, there's a lot of thinking. We've been in this extended period now for quite some time. Bargaining power has declined. Wages have been flat for a very, very long time. The recovery from a massive recession was quite slow and not very robust. What is it that's going to change that's going to return us to the historical picture?
Well, of course, is just the historical level. We expect things to get back. We expect the Fed to continue to raise interest rates. We see a pattern there that's going to affect things. Keep in mind we have baby boomers who are going to be retiring and withdrawing savings. That's likely to have an impact on interest rates in the long run. I'm going to give kind of an incomplete answer, but we have written a couple of things, at least a couple of pages on why we think interest rates are likely to go up. I'm probably not going to do it justice, but we do see that, and I do know that there's some folks who think interest rates don't necessarily have to go up. One of the points I'd like to make, though, is if interest rates don't go up, it's because the economy's in trouble, and so we're likely to have a big drop in GDP growth. So it's a double-edged thing.
Could you give us a ballpark figure about the accuracy of the projections that you made in the past? How accurate are your figures? Just ballpark, a broad view.
Well, every couple of years we do a review of our forecasting, economic forecasting record. How close were we, how not? We compare it to Blue Chip, we compare it to OMB. We do as well as everybody. We do as well as, or better. We do very good on that.
Which is what? How well do?
Oh gosh, I don't remember offhand. We're actually working on our latest one. At some point, I'll get a chance to review it and see what exactly the number is. We're as good as anybody, I think, is sort of the punchline. And there's a reason why that's sort of important, especially lately, is because when projecting the future on anything is hard, and sometimes it's really hard. So if you just look at how well did you do compared to your projection, in some respects that's not fair, because some things are harder to predict than others. Maybe the best question is, how did you do compared to what other people forecast? Which is why I'm saying, at least on the economic forecast, we do as well as anybody.
I know you're only supposed to ask one question, but I have not read, if they took the insurance profits that health insurance companies are making out of the health care thing, took away insurance, profit and costs, how would that affect health? The cost that they pay insurance stockholders, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, well, it depends on what specific policy you're talking about that does that. So one of the things I've learned in this job is you can't make broad statements. It depends on, it's lots on the details of exactly how you would do something like that for us to sort of think through the estimates. It's part of our, I'd say that the most frustrating thing we do, that frustrates members of Congress, is we work at a slower pace than they do sometimes. They've got legislation, they're negotiating, they're making changes, and we're going, okay, that'll take us a week to get back to you on that. And they're not operating under that sort of, so it's this sort of due diligence where we go very carefully about understanding what the change is. We reach out, talk to experts. We do all that stuff every time on things. So I've learned not to sort of guess on something like that, that the details really matter in this sort of thing.
So why don't we make this the last question?
Okay.
Dan Sachs, Indiana University, and I also have a prediction question. So what
I
strikes me,
predicted that.
what strikes me as particularly challenging about what the CBO does is that they're conditional forecasts, that under current law, what would happen, and it's
Right.
never the case really that law is totally unchanged from year to year. So I just wondered, how do you think that the CBO should be evaluated in terms of its prediction qualities, and leave it at that.
Sure. I think we should be evaluated how we're actually trying to do more of it. We do our economic projection every couple of years. Early last year, we did our first ever projection of how we do in revenues. So look at how we did at revenues. That's complicated because you have to take into account changes in law and et cetera, but we did that. And we're working on our outlays, our first ever outlays one. So that'll be coming out soon. So, but the tricky part is exactly this. You know, whenever we update things, we have to figure out, well, how did law change? How did the economy change? And then that little middle that says technical. That's maybe sometimes an error. Although maybe it's sometimes implementation, right? Because you don't know how these things are going to be implemented. It's forecasting a lot of stuff. In fact, it's really, I think you're right, it's kind of not really a forecast. It's sort of a projection under current law and our current understanding of implementation, and that stuff can change. It's really an issue right now, for example, with the current administration talking about changing implementation of things. Well, at some point, once we see solidly what is going to change, we'll have to change our baseline based on this difference in implementation, even though there may not be a change in law. So that's tricky for us.
So Keith, thank you so much.
Sure.
I really appreciate Tim coming over.